Welcome to History Respawn. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. And on today's episode, we're playing Tannenberg, a squad-based multiplayer game set during the First World War on the battlefields of the Eastern Front. My guest on today's show is Chris Kempshaw, a historian of the First World War and the author of The First World War in Computer Games, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Chris, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Again.
Well, it couldn't have been that bad the first time, so we might as well try to mess up this time. So as you can see here on the screen, Chris is joining me for this stream. We have just created our own squad, miraculously, for two historians to be able to do this. And now we're going to try to join a multiplayer match. We're currently on the EU servers, which it is early evening over in Europe, so hopefully there'll be a good player base to experience this game with. So let me see how we do.
This is going to be the moment when people discover that we're not very good at games.
Well, now, Chris, you told me before the stream that you've been playing this for about 8 hours, and
I think I've clocked up about 9 or so hours.
9 hours. Okay, so I've got about an hour and 45 minutes in. So, in other words, you should be better than me. We'll see.
No pressure.
Okay. All right. So let's drop this in, and I'm gonna just go ahead and spawn. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm gonna spawn. I suspect I'm coming in next to you.
I think so. All right.
Okay. What can we see here? So I'm overlooking what appears to be a hill fort filmed with very, very angry Germans.
There we go.
One of the things I quite like about these games, in opposed to kind of more, I don't know, I hesitate to say arcadey shooters and the like, but I like the fact that ammo is an issue, that you get basically 5 shots and that's your lot.
Yeah. Oh, getting shot from behind here.
Oh, that's... nobody wants that.
Never mind. I took care of it. With a sword.
Problem solved!
So Chris, I know this might be a little bit difficult to talk history while you are in the midst of a multiplayer match, but could you give our audience kind of a brief background on the namesake for this game, the Battle of Tannenberg?
So the Battle of Tannenberg is effectively one of the kind of the main early war successes for the German army, and is a fairly unmitigated disaster for the Russian army. It comes very, very early in the war, in 1914, so it's about the 26th to the 30th of 1914, with the Russian invasion of Prussia. And largely the German army had not expected the Russians to be able to do anything that early on. A lot of their pre-war planning had largely been to destroy the French to the west, and then deal with the Russians once they finally reached the point when they could actually mobilize. But the Russians mobilize much quicker than thought, and the Germans actually weaken their push on France as a result of it. But the Russian invasion of this is going to went badly. Said many Russian generals.
Said many Russian generals. Yeah, exactly.
They invade with 2 armies, the first and the second army, and the idea is we're going to kind of smash the Germans between them, and it's going to be fantastic. We're going to invade Prussia, then we're going to deal with the Austrians, and then everybody's going to die, and what a glorious day for anybody who studied any form of history know that glorious days for Russia, in military terms, sometimes can be few and far between. And what ends up happening is the general in charge at Tannenberg, who's in charge of the Second Army, General Alexander Smazanov, is, I think, probably most charitably to be said, not a military genius. And his plan to kind of smash the German army in between the two Russian armies winds up being a completely uncoordinated mess, really. And the Germans are able to outmaneuver the Russian forces and annihilate the Second Army, to the extent that Smazanov himself commits suicide rather than live with the consequences of what he's done.
Lovely.
Again, that, you know, it's something of a Russian tradition. Now, of that army, 120,000 men are given as losses for the Russians. Now, only about 30,000 of those are killed. 95 or so thousand are taken prisoner, along with basically the entirety of their equipment. Now, again, when we're dealing with kind of Russian military history, one of the things that we can always be kind of sure of, oh, you lost 120,000 men. Well, you know, there's plenty more Russians where they came from. Frankly, what there aren't a lot more of is guns, weaponry, anything that the Russians can actually fight a war with. And that's a massive problem for the Russians. I just got absolutely annihilated by a mortar.
Yes.
That's a big problem for the Russians, replenishing their supplies. They didn't have enough to begin with. They end up, over the course of the war, trading men to the French in exchange for rifles. They send a Russian expeditionary force to France in an attempt to kind of trade those guys for some form of weaponry. But it never really takes off, and there's a variety of problems with it, as there always are. But that is effectively a really early indication of some of the problems that the Russians are going to have at times in the war, in dealing with losses, dealing with the terrible collapse of morale after the defeat at Tannenberg. Because what had effectively been an invasion of Prussia that had been going all right, then becomes an unmitigated disaster. The Germans push them all the way back. There's defeats further down the line, and the kind of the foundations of the eventual collapse in 1917 come from this feeling that they had this wonderful opportunity and they blew it.
Yeah.
And these unsustainable losses just can't easily be dealt with, and that's a kind of an ongoing problem. However, when it comes to understanding the battle, it's slightly kind of the opposite of what you think a First World War battle is going to be, because Tannenberg's a battle of maneuver. The Germans divide these two massive Russian armies and then they annihilate one of them. So it's, you know, I hesitate to say kind of Napoleonic, but it's a war of movement. Whereas, you know, we tend to think of the First World War very much in kind of trench stationary terms.
Right.
What you then see in regards to this game is, even this game mode is called maneuver. It's about moving around the battlefield. It's about capturing strongholds. It's about encirclement. And I think that's an element that really differentiates it from its precursor, Verdun, which was far more about kind of general trench warfare and the like. Now, that's got obvious kind of gameplay benefits in that it will, you know, no one really wants to play Trench Simulator 2019, really, deep down. I mean, we might, but beyond that, I don't know whether or not anyone's going to be super into it. But this, because it's Eastern Front, gives you the opportunity to do that kind of running around, actually, you know, capturing stuff.
Yeah.
It feels a little bit more worthwhile, if that makes sense.
It does. I feel like this game, and we both played Verdun, and you know, it's a great game. I think it works actually pretty well as a historical simulation if you're really serious about it. But I also think that it's a game that is an acquired taste, whereas this one feels much more like a popular multiplayer game. Like Battlefield, for instance, where, like you said, you've got maneuver, you've got the ability to capture resource points, to hold on to terrain, and it's satisfying.
Yeah, I think this is a better game.
Yeah.
Than Verdun, and we've spoken about. I really liked Verdun, but this feels smoother, and it's not as punishing as Verdun. Verdun could be a really punishing game to play if you didn't fully understand what it was you were doing, and that kind of one-shot kill. I did surprisingly well in that round. That kind of one-shot kill thing can be really good fun, but it can also be, I haven't seen anybody in 15 minutes, and all that happens is I die.
Let's see where we're going. The Carpathians, maybe? Okay, yeah, let's go with that.
I like this. I like the little history snippets that you get, because I sometimes think that the Eastern Fronts in the both World Wars are kind of like the military history nerd's choice of interest. But in general terms, I would place a reasonable amount of money on the fact that nobody in this country knows anything about the Eastern Front of the First World War. Just nothing. It's just, here be dragons, and that's your lot.
Yeah. Now, by this country, do you mean the United States, or do you mean...
I'll go with Britain. Okay. But if you think there's a hotbed of Eastern Front First World War supporting fanatics in America, I'll defer to you.
No. I was going to say that not many Americans know that the First World War happened. So.
Come on, let me spawn. There we go.
I think a nice thing about this game, and obviously this is kind of a gameplay decision, but it's not just the Battle of Tannenberg. It's kind of general battlefields across the Eastern Front, which gives it good variety, I think.
Yeah, I think so. They were doing a really interesting thing recently, a little update where they introduced wolves. And they do that from time to time, because one of the kind of the ongoing stories, and I've said to friends before that I don't understand why no one's ever done a horror film about it, is that at times on the Eastern Front, like large packs of wolves who are having their world destroyed around them would just attack soldiers, and you get kind of informal truces between the Entente forces and the Central Powers to kind of kill them off. And last week they replicated that in game, so you'd be fighting a battle and then some wolves would start howling and then they all come and try and kill you, which I think was quite an interesting little extra historical element that they introduced to things that you don't always kind of get with the Western Front, because people kind of feel it speaks for itself.
Yeah. Well,
that's a lot of Germans.
Am I right?
They shot me.
Am I right in thinking that they did a Christmas truce segment for Verdun?
Yes, they do, and I'm pretty sure they do it every year.
Okay.
And it's one of the strangest but most interesting things about First World War games that happened, I think, during the centenary, that you would have these truce moments where you could kind of take part for and you get an achievement for it, and you'd form on a map and you'd throw snowballs at each other, or you'd kick a football about and stuff like that, which I find kind of, there's an element of ahistoricness to it. The truces definitely happened, but they're very much a kind of a time and a place 1914 thing, as opposed to all over the place kind of thing.
Yes.
Despite that, I find it really interesting that there is this kind of interest in them, to the extent that it is replicated every single year. And there was a 2-minute silence in both Verdun and Tannenberg in the last November, in the very recent 11th of November, where if you were kind of silent in game for 2 minutes, then you'd get an achievement for that as well. Which again, I just find really interesting, this kind of mix-up of reality commemoration with in-game achievements of sorts.
Yes.
but also that kind of sense of, are you doing it because you want the achievement? Are you doing it because you care? The kind of the performative remembrance or the actual remembrance. But then also the question, is there a difference? Do people wear poppies because they actually care or because they feel they should have to?
There are a lot of Germans around here.
There are a lot of Germans around here. Now, one of the things I quite like about the game as well is, and I genuinely can't remember if this was the case in Verdun, so if it was, everybody who's now going to be screaming at me on Twitch for this being stupid, forgive me, is that they have bots, NPCs,
Yes.
who kind of pad out the groups, and I'm fairly certain that a reasonable amount of these are NPCs, given the fact they keep missing me. Whereas I strongly suspect that actual human beings would be absolutely destroying me at the moment. And I can't remember whether or not they used to do that in Verdun as well.
I can't remember either. Although I think when I was playing Verdun, it was pretty popular, so it wasn't too hard to find.
That's the thing.
Full games.
Yeah, but when it was quiet, it felt like you could have big empty maps.
Yeah.
With, you'd go a while before encountering another player, and I like the fact that to ensure that you have that kind of feel of being part of a large-scale battle, that the game itself, pads out the people who are missing.
Yeah. So, kind of a hallmark of Black Mill's World War I games, Verdun and Tannenberg, is that it has, what they call a First World War feel, in the sense that, unlike other first-person multiplayer games like Battlefield or Call of Duty, you die essentially after 1 or 2 shots.
Yes.
And you are also using era-specific weaponry. So, in a Call of Duty World War II game or in a Battlefield World War I game, you're very often given kind of advanced or hypothetical weaponry, whereas in this game, it is the weapons of the time, which were prone to be very disappointing to modern audiences. So I'm wondering, what do you make of this style of multiplayer game as a First World War experience?
I quite like it. I've always slightly kind of... the Battlefield games and the like are kind of arcadey fun to an extent. Although I played Call of Duty World War II and there was nobody having fun in that game. And I like... One of my favourite games when I was younger was a game called Operation Flashpoint, which gave birth to games like Arma and all the kind of the mod games that come from that. And that was very much a kind of a, if you get shot, you will die. And that kind of level of skill that then becomes of it. And I think these games often market themselves on that. You have to be reasonably skilled to survive, or at the very least to kind of to do anything in it. And the benefit of that is that it kind of makes people feel it's more authentic. You're playing with breech-loaded rifles and the like, and short magazines, and if you get shot, you die, and there's no body armor. It's not kind of a case of, if you've been heavily machine gunned, but if you crouch down behind a Jeep for 5 minutes, you'll probably be fine.
Right.
That kind of Call of Duty, Modern Warfare feel to it. And I think that it lends a different type of authenticity. I think authenticity is a very difficult kind of loaded term when it comes to war games. And I think in my book I kind of effectively coined the term authenticity light, in the sense that nobody actually wants an authentic First World War game, because it would be dull as all hell.
Yes.
What they want is something that feels like how we think it should be. And I think that's what Verdun and Tannenberg are aiming for. A game that feels like how we think a game like this should be. So, it's difficult. There's a lot going on. You can't be everywhere at once. You're not a hero. You're not like a one-man, killing squad, where you're carrying, multiple machine guns in each arm and grenades and all that type of stuff. You're part of a mass. and that can either go very well or it can go very badly.
Yes.
But by the same token, no one else is, unless they're just better than you, and God knows there are plenty of people on this game who are miles better than me. It doesn't matter too much if you're not great at it, because it's going to partially balance itself out to an extent. And I think that kind of balance is a very useful and important thing in considering online games like this.
Yes.
Because, again, if you were to make it like super authentic, none of these Russian soldiers, or like half of these Russian soldiers, might not have rifles.
Yes.
They certainly wouldn't have a huge amount of ammunition to put in them. They'd be demoralised, and at some point they'd go home. And as historically interesting as that would be, I don't know if that's quite what Blackmill or the players are going to be going for. Playing a hyper-realistic game of an incredibly demoralised army on a never-ending death war on the Eastern Front.
Yeah, I think that would be a bridge too far for most players. Maybe the most ardent of First World War history buffs would enjoy that, but not most everybody else.
Yeah. The Germans, they're all incredibly angry.
And I was executed for desertion, for accidentally advancing.
Oh, they're for accidentally... do they... Yeah, we're executing you for desertion for being too vigorous in your pursuit of the enemy. That well-known historical First World War instance of just being too into it.
Yes. I do enjoy, you said that you kind of get a sense from this game that you are part of a larger collective, but you do have your squad with you, and so you do get in-game bonuses for staying with your squad, for working with your squad. And so that's helpful. It helps you feel like, in some respects, it's a smaller game than it actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the kind of the game divided up into all of these kind of I'm trying to think of the right word, capture points, effectively. It's a variety of small games in a big space.
Yes.
Now, obviously, this is the first time I've played in an actual squad with somebody that I was talking to. And I don't know if I've seen you for 15 minutes, so I don't think I'm getting all of the bonus points that I should do.
Well, Chris, I'm leading from the rear.
Fantastic.
Classic World War I fashion. Yeah, and I do like these moments, and this happens a bit more often when the game is filled with actual players rather than bots, but you do get these moments where the computer, the AI, is essentially directing you to one resource point, to one victory location, and you have a rush of 20 or more other players going to the same objective. And it does have the look of what I think most players would expect a World War I game to have. You've got the whistles going off, you've got the soldiers charging their position, and then usually you have one or two defenders who are firing machine guns. And actually, on my screen right now, I'm on the spawn point. You've got one of these instances going on where our side is attempting to move from the entrenched buildings to the 305 millimeter gun, and a large wave of us have just been killed off, unfortunately. But those
I've just come around the corner of that entrenched building. There are a lot of people here.
Yes, but you do get those moments where it has the look and feel, and I think with the kind of the license that this game takes with some of the weaponry, or the presence of weaponry if you're a Russian soldier, that can be largely forgiven, I think, because of what else it does with this model of gameplay. And I think it at least strives for a greater level of authenticity than what you get with, like you said, the kind of battlefields or the Call of Duties.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that some of the conditions at times change. So sometimes there's a variable, whether it's going to be daylight, whether it's going to be snowing and the like. On some of the missions, or kind of some of the maps as well, which I quite like, are kind of a variableness to the kind of the nature of the warfare, which I think is quite interesting.
Yes. I was just gunned down trying to take the machine gun nest at the top of the hill, so...
Yeah, they seem very... I mean, because again with this issue of balance, having used some of those machine guns at times, they are spectacularly badly sighted.
Yes.
You can't fire down the hill, it's really annoying. But there'll be a time when you're in the right machine gun at the right place and a bunch of people will come around the corner and you open fire and it feels right.
Yes.
As in, this could conceivably have been how it was.
Here we go, charging the hill again.
Yeah.
Let's see if this works. Here they come.
I'm gonna kill that officer. Like my training told me. My training to be a Russian peasant.
Oh, I really thought I had that one. So Chris, we've just gone through the centenary of the First World War, and I'm wondering, what do you make of the First World War games that have come out in the last 4 or 5 years to mark the centenary of the war? Is there anything that's interesting to you about the ways in which games have depicted the Great War?
I think it's been interesting to see kind of some of the spread and some of the evolution of games over the time period. And I when we last kind of did one of these, it must have been back in, I don't know, 2015, 2016, something like that. Yep. When Battlefield 1 had just come out. And where I kind of talked about my idea that Battlefield 1 was kind of Verdun plus Valiant Hearts. It was a first-person shooter, although obviously a kind of a Battlefield-ized version of it, with a narrative story element at times, which enable people to kind of, and EA DICE to tell stories. And I found that very interesting, that the idea that the First World War isn't just a place to, go and shoot people. He says whilst lining up on a German soldier in the woods and shooting him in the face. But it's also a place for telling that that guy's not getting home to his family. A place to tell interesting narrative stories. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of evolved at times, not necessarily in the way that we would have all necessarily hoped, I think, because I adored Valiant Hearts as a game. I think it's absolutely beautiful. I think it tells a really interesting story. It's a really interesting approach. It's got a really interesting kind of lineage in regards to its relationship to a French documentary called Apocalypse World War One. Mm-hmm. And I kind of wish that we'd had more of things like that. Now, we got 11/11 Memories Retold, which was almost like a spiritual successor to Valiant Hearts. It was created by many of the same guys who'd worked on it. Young Venice, who worked on Valiant Hearts, worked again on creating 11/11 Memories Retold, and I did some kind of consulting work with them on it.
Oh, did you really? Oh, that's wonderful.
I did. I kind of came in at various stages of the process, and in the special edition of their game, they had like a graphic novel, which kind of told bits and pieces of the story, but also had historical facts alongside it. So when the players are doing this is the wider war issue, and I wrote the historical facts for that, which was great fun. It was very much a kind of a dream bucket list thing for me. But I still feel there's more narrative potential in the First World War than we necessarily got the most of. There was still stuff that we could have done with it before the centenary then came to an end, and I wonder what the future is for First World War games, because Battlefield 1 is almost certainly, to my mind, the most successful, biggest selling piece of First World War media that has ever existed.
I think
right by about 2017, it sold 16 million copies or something absolutely mad like that. You know, I mean, you interact with students and that over there, and I do it over here. Far more of my students will have played Battlefield 1 than have interacted with anything else First World War ever. And for years and years and years, the byword for the First World War over here was this TV series Blackadder. Well, to my mind, it isn't anymore. It's Battlefield 1.
Yeah.
But then Battlefield and EA DICE used that as a jumping off point to create Battlefield World War II. To kind of return to their roots in that sense, which again I can completely understand why they did that. They thought they kind of told the story or the interaction with this game or this war that they wanted to, and that's totally fine. You know, I'm not going to blame them for not making more First World War games. But I wonder if anyone's going to make more First World War games. There are bits and pieces that I've seen of, and there's a game that I cannot remember. There's a guy got killed next to me just now, and he is screaming, and it's really in a computer game format. But I do wonder what comes next.
Yeah.
Effectively, you know, is this our lot now? You know, Verdun did the Western Front and Tannenberg did the Eastern Front, and I think that's great. But what else?
Yeah.
And I think to an extent that there's only so much that can be dragged out of this type of game, a kind of a shooter format for the First World War. And I think there is so much narrative potential left in the war. And narrative potential, I don't necessarily know if you can easily replicate from Second World War games, because everybody knows how knows the story of the Second World War, whereas I think there are stories still to be told in First World War games, and I hope, really hope, and not just for the sake of my flagging academic career, that there are more stories that we can get out of the war in this medium.
Yeah. Well, do you feel like the success of Battlefield 1 has kind of halted or kind of cordoned off the potential success of other types of games? I mean, you talked about Memories 1111, you talked about Ubisoft's title, which is escaping me for the moment, but
Valiant Hearts,
of course. But do you feel like the overwhelming success of Battlefield 1 has made it so that if there's going to be a First World War game, it's only going to be in this style? I kind of veer both ways on it. I think that Battlefield 1 probably means that you're not going to get that many more, if any, first-person shooters like this. I think that Tannenberg allowed Verdun to redo Verdun in a really interesting way. But I think that games companies are going to go, well, Battlefield 1 hoovered up this market, made a ton of money, but are we going to do anything that they didn't? And if we are, how much money are we going to have to spend? And I wonder whether or not that's going to place a block on it. Whereas I wonder whether or not that kind of narrative thing, we got an absolute ton of points and medals in that one, would allow people to tell stories. Now, I don't know if 1111 Memories Retold sold as much as DigixArt would have liked it to have done. I'm going to be reasonably proud that I got 115 kills. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's a very proud day for me. So I don't know whether or not it sold as much as they would have wanted it to, and whether or not that will then produce a block on kind of more narrative games coming out, or whether or not the end of the centenary will have put a block and people will think, interest in it has passed. It's a difficult one to say. I hope it isn't the end of it, because I think as game kind of technology grows, there could be some really interesting stuff. Part of me still wonders whether or not Creative Assembly are going to create a First World War game. And for years I thought no. And then they made the Total War games.
Yes.
Not the Total War, the Warhammer games.
Warhammer, yes.
Where you have different objectives and you have flying units and you can lose the game if the AI does certain things. And a lot of it just screamed out to me like a proto-campaign map for some form of First World War game. Now, I don't know whether or not that's going to be the case, but I think creating a really interestingly polished Creative Assembly strategy game would almost in a way return some of the First World War games to its roots, but also do something really interesting with it. What I would hope for, and I've done some writing on this, and hopefully it'll come out at some point. It's in kind of a variety of kind of reviews and the like. Was that I interviewed various kind of games developers about where they got their history from. You know, what are the sources that First World War developers use for their games? In a kind of a view is it possible for us as historians to get our work better understood by a better audience? You know, what books do they read? Because all of these guys who create First World War games identify themselves as First World War history nerds, by and large, which I find really interesting. They all had this kind of interest in the First World War before they started making these games. But that means they've been reading stuff.
Yeah.
So, you know, what did they read? What history did they interact with? You know, are they revisionists? Are they purists? Are they kind of 1960s history? Is it 1990s revisionist? Is it more transnational history? That type of stuff. And I think that if historians and developers can really kind of properly work together, there are some fantastically interesting games that could come out of it.
Well, are there any, general themes or maybe even specific topics that you feel haven't been well represented by the First World War games that have come out? I mean, I feel like we've now got games that are at least representing or trying to represent the lives of ordinary soldiers in often cartoonish and arcadey fashion, but they nevertheless exist. I mean, do you feel like that kind of grand strategic level that you're talking about with Total War, do you think that is kind of a fruitful opportunity or for another game developer to come along, or are there any other areas that maybe you haven't mentioned yet?
I think that there is an element of, there is something in that grand strategy thing, because again, one of the things I remember we talked about last time was the fact that First World War games are terrible at talking about why the First World War happened, and how it was fought and what it all meant, and you know, the realities and some of the outcomes of it on a grand strategic level. And at times it gets a little bit too national histories for my liking. That, you know, if you put on the box, you know, it's a war of alliances, I want to see those alliances represented at some point in the game.
Yeah. And
I don't just say that as a historian of Allied relations, although again, game developers, you have my email address. But that kind of, you know, if it's a world war, let's explore what that means.
Yeah.
And a part of the thing, again, that I remember we talked about previously, was that how unwilling, and understandably unwilling, I get it, why these games are to go anywhere near Empire, Africa, Asia, the realities of what it meant to be a colonial subject. And, you know, if you want to go anywhere near that, you're going to need to be very careful, because if you do it badly, and again, I'm looking at you, Duty World War II, dealing with sensitive topics in a really bad way, you're going to offend a lot of people. But if you do it in a grown-up manner, of you know, games that there are stories to be told in, there are fascinating stories to be told in the First World War. And even if we look at Tannenberg, you know, a game that I enjoy, and I'm enjoying myself right now, you know, what's the point of, you know, why are we fighting in these places on the Eastern Front? What does it all mean? What are the stakes? You know, how does the warfare in a 1915 map differentiate from a 1916 map?
Mm-hmm.
How do the forces in these battles differentiate themselves from each other? There's a tendency at times to homogenize the First World War, which I understand why, again, because these games aren't looking to deliver a history lesson.
Yeah.
But at the same time, these games are looking to deliver a history lesson. And the history is fascinating. Of course I'd say that, and of course you'd say that as well. But people play it because they're interested.
Yeah.
So maybe we could start going a little further with some of these aspects of the war, and kind of understanding, not simply, this thing happened, but why did this thing happen?
Mm-hmm.
Why did it happen here and now? If we, as the Entente forces, win this map, and, I'll feel pretty good about it, but is it going to matter in the larger war effect, knowing what we know that happens on the Eastern Front, that it ends up being an absolute German victory?
Mm-hmm.
Come 1917 and the early part of 1918, all of these German soldiers are throwing a massive party because they won their war, and felt pretty damn good about it. So what does the Eastern Front mean for the Western Front? What does it mean for the wider war effort?
Yeah.
We could really kind of make an interesting contextual discussion about some of this. And that's actually one of the things I kind of liked at times about Battlefield 1. I'm pretty sure there was a game mode for multiplayer where you could string battles together. So depending on whether you won or lost, you would withdraw to a different map or advance onto the next map. And it would create a kind of a wider contextual campaign feel to it.
It was called...
which I thought was a really cool, interesting thing.
Yeah, I think it was called Operations.
That's it.
You would pick an operation. And I agree that did really a pretty good job of maybe not getting you the grand strategy level of experience, but giving you a strategy level nevertheless, and what is important about this region, why it's being fought over. And, I think we're doing some of these games a little bit of a disservice. I mean, I feel like Battlefield 1, despite all of its arcadiness, it does have a recognition of the wider war, and it does have a little bit of not only the Eastern Front, but of Turkey and ANZAC troops, things that you don't typically get in most of these games, where it's kind of about the tragedy of the soldiers on the front lines of the Western Front.
Yes.
So, and,
you're an Italian soldier fighting Austro-Hungarians in the Dolomite.
Yeah.
That's mad. That would never happen. You would never get a game allowing you to do that. Ever, ever, ever. I'd have called anybody mad if they'd have said that to me in, 2014.
I don't know if you noticed, but you just shot me dead.
Oh, God, really?
You did. A historian on
so
historian
sorry.
crime. I mean, this is as bad as coming at me in a book review or something like that. So
it's a very much a Highlander interview in that there can be only.
Well, it should be up to the First World War historian to do better than the Imperial historian at this kind of game.
But you'll be able to take the Imperial Grand kind of overview of this, and you might lose this battle, but come the end of the war's end, you'll be stronger for it.
Exactly. Just kind of going back to the general topic of First World War in games, I would say that, I think it is, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but I think it is easy to ridicule and criticize these games a bit, but I think that historians in general, I don't know what your sense has been, and I'm curious as to what your opinion is, but I feel as though a lot of historians are still kind of stuck in a rut with their analysis of the First World War, in the sense that during the centenary I felt like we got a lot of reconsiderations of the First World War, but most of those tended to be about the front line of the Western Front, and that the kind of push towards including the wider world, including Empire, I felt like it stalled out a little bit historiographically prior to the centenary. I don't know if I'm off base there. I don't know what your perspective is on that.
I think I would tend to agree to an extent. I think a lot of good came from the centenary. I've also just realised that we're actually now on opposite teams.
We are.
Which I hadn't realised before. That
You got me again.
I just shot you. I'm so sorry. There's a tendency at times with the centenary to almost kind of turn it into myth of the First World War centenary achieved nothing, and set the movement of nations back decades. Whereas a reasonable amount of good stuff did come out of it. Again, I think we could always have done more. I think in Britain that there's a far greater kind of understanding of some of the imperial experiences of the war now, particularly revolving around Indian soldiers in the British Empire, which I think is a universally good thing, and is a thing that I'm quite pleased about that's come out of the centenary. For years leading up to it, the International Society for First World War Studies has been promoting a kind of a transnational approach and understanding to the war, which I'm very keen on and kind of appears a lot in my work, to kind of get us away from national histories. And I don't think that the centenary did that really very well at all. Now, there's reasons for that, particularly in England, partly in a sense of the, we're British and we'll do whatever the hell we want. Seems to be a mindset that exists at length at times. It was better in Europe, I think, that they did a better job of kind of framing it as a European experience. But beyond that, I think there were issues, and I think a lot of that comes from, for the British, the fact that we had our Brexit thing in the middle of it.
Yes.
Which caused a lot of problems for First World War historians, and a lot of problems. I actually, you know what, that statement stands by itself. It caused a lot of problems.
Yeah.
And having this big attempt to understand the European nature of the war at a time when, a reasonable number of people in Britain were having issues with Europe, created a very difficult environment to talk about the First World War as a moment, as a thing.
Interesting.
And the fact that coincided almost exactly with the Somme centenary was really, really bad timing, because it's 2016, and the Somme in Britain is largely understood through a British lens.
Yes.
It's a British experience, it's a British battle. That's not the reality, though. It's not a British battle. It's not a British experience. There is a British experience of the Somme in the same way there's a British experience of anything, but it's a huge Allied offensive. 1916 is a story of Allied offensives. Well, we just couldn't go anywhere near it in that time and that place to properly kind of discuss the Allied nature, and it completely changed parts of the planned. Oh god, I nearly shot one of my own men. The Allied, or the kind of the European commemoration, because then Macron would be at Thiepval on the 1st of July 2016, and then you got the EU vote, and then he decided, this is a moment to make a political statement, and then he was there, and the whole thing just got incredibly difficult and incredibly messy.
Yeah.
So I wonder at some point, I've said kind of to friends and colleagues for a while, it's going to take us a while to really understand the impact of the First World War centenary. What the legacy of the First World War centenary is going to take us a while to figure out. And I wonder how much we're going to end up thinking or having to understand some of the wider political context. Because obviously, we've got Brexit, you've got Trump, that are changing the way our countries interact with the rest of the world and how the rest of the world sees us. And then at the same time, we're trying to commemorate a huge international thing.
A historic alliance, right? Which,
Yeah.
in a time when alliances are frayed, to say the least.
Yes.
And the idea of unions, federal unions in the States or economic unions in Europe are seen as controversial when perhaps they shouldn't be. Who knows?
Yes.
I'm not a politician or political expert, so I'll just put that out front. But it is stressful, I think. And, it's funny, we always, or at least, historians, they always attempt to put historical works of the past in their historical context, because that context can play into the way that history is written so much. And I think this period right now, 2010s, this decade, is going to be a very interesting time for future historians to go back to and to consider historiography and think about the ways in which political crises around the world influence the histories that were written, and the ways in which major events like the First World War were remembered during the 100th anniversary of the conflict. It's just a fascinating thing to think about, and it would be nice if we could go ahead and get out of these current political crises and just get to the part where we're looking back on this era. With
skip straight to the credits.
Yeah, skip straight to the end. I did want to mention we've got somebody who's been making comments in the Twitch chat.
Oh, amazing!
And I think they have a question. This one must have come in at the very beginning. They had a question regarding the captives, 120,000 captives at the end of Battle of Tannenberg.
Yes.
What happened to them?
That's a really good question. Now, not being an expert on the Eastern Front or on kind of prisoners of war, however, what I can say, it's difficult to say exactly what happened to those, but I do know that Russian prisoners were at the bottom of the barrel when it came to how Germans would treat them. So they would get generally the worst treatment in prisoner of war camps, but also they get the worst treatment from their own allies. Like the British and the French were mortified at the idea they might have to spend time with the Russians in prisoner of war camps, which led to a really snarky letter sent via the Red Cross by Germany to the Allies, saying that if it turns out they don't like each other, maybe they should have considered this before entering into alliance with each other. But I suspect that the answer to that question is probably nothing good. Obviously, the eventual collapse of the Russians on the Eastern Front creates any number of kind of bad situations for everybody over there, and that chap is really very keen on shooting me. That's one of my own guys, and I shot him. You also then have this kind of political reliability question. So I mentioned previously the Russian Expeditionary Force in France, which there's a fantastic book by Jamie Cockfield called With Snow on Their Boots about the Russian Expeditionary Force in France. And it's very much a kind of a, what the hell are you people doing here? type story.
You got me again.
Yeah. In a kind of, oh God, I'm sorry. There's a very serious war going on back in Russia that you guys might want to get involved in. And yet here you are in the middle of France fighting a horrible battle. But when the revolution then comes, and some of these guys, the French quarantine these Russian prisoners before they get sent home, there are questions about whether or not they're politically reliable. Are they going to go back and fight for the whites? Are they going to go back and fight for the reds? Both of these groups view them with an element of distrust. Some of them end up staying in, kind of emigrating and kind of becoming emigres in Paris. So I wonder whether or not a similar thing is going to happen to some of these guys who were captured very early in the war. If the Germans then choose at some point post-war or in the years afterwards to release them, how kind of politically reliable are they going to be viewed by all of these kind of competing aspects in the Russian Civil War, which obviously is going to go on for decades after, not decades, for years afterwards, and it's going to be, it's going to absolutely rip Russia to pieces. But going from a German prisoner of war camp to a Russian civil war is probably not going to be the easiest kind of shift in mindset you're ever going to encounter. So how's that going to work out for all of these guys? And I think that's a really kind of interesting thing to consider. That for a while now, historians like John Horn and the like have been talking about what they refer to as the wider war, or the greater war, which is not 1914 to 1918, but 1914 to say 1923 or 1924.
Yep.
And I think that's a useful way of framing the Eastern Front experience.
Yes.
In the, there's a tendency for us to go, oh, great news, everybody, the First World War is finished, November the 11th, 1918. Well, British, American, French soldiers are going to carry on fighting in Russia to the early 1920s. They're not coming home just yet, and you get outbreaks of horrendous kind of warfare and genocide in places in the immediate post-war period. So to understand the kind of the Russian experience, November the 11th, 1918 is meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. The combat between on the Eastern Front between the Central Powers and the Entente finishes, to all intents and purposes, in November 1917, and then the signing of Brest-Litovsk kind of formalizes the Russian surrender. But it's not, that was a great war, but let's all go home to our peaceful lives now. That's not how this story ends on the Eastern Front. So to understand what's going to kind of happen, 1918 is too limiting a cut-off point, because it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea, and I think this idea of changing the periodization of the war, thinking about the longer war, the larger war, whichever way you want to call it, is a useful thing, and it's something that European historians have been doing for a long time with what they see now as the European crisis, right? Going from not just 1914, 1918, 1939 to 1945, but instead taking that entire era as one historical moment.
Yes.
And thinking of it that way. I think that those kind of tricks, those kind of ideas are useful for perhaps getting new types of histories, ones that we're not necessarily familiar with in the same way as the kind of old standbys. So yeah, hopefully things change. I think, like you said, there's been some really great work during the centenary. Obviously, there's been a lot of great games during that same time period, but it would be nice if this isn't a moment to say goodbye to the First World War, but instead to see different types of histories, different types of games going forward. And I don't imagine First World War games will ever become as interesting to the wider public as World War II. I think World War II as an idea, as a moment in historical memory, is incredibly powerful. But I have been encouraged by what I've seen. To think before this era, these past 3 or 4 years, when there weren't any First World War games, really, and now as you've noted, we've had several, maybe a dozen or so. And that's incredible. That's incredible to think about. That is change over time, as we like to say.
Yes, absolutely. So I remain hopeful that we get more. What I'm hoping is that the games that kind of were kind of released, and the games that I found most interesting, did enough commercially to not put everybody else off.
Yeah.
Because that's probably what's going to decide it at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
As much as I would love games developers to sit around and go, you know what, I think that the society needs a really interesting transnational First World War game.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think it's probably going to happen, because if at the same time as they go, we need a really interesting transnational game, if it doesn't make any money, then they're not going to do it. And I hope that the games that were successful enough to not make everyone write it off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, fingers crossed. Well, that does it for me. Chris, is there anything else you want to end with?
Just to say thank you very much for having me. I've had a lot of fun. For anybody who's watching as well, feel free to carry on kind of conversation and that on Twitter.
Yeah.
where we both we both lurk in a variety of ways. I'm delighted that whilst we were doing this, that we didn't get like a cascade of horrible insults from other people who were playing, because I was wondering if we were going to get stream sniped at some point.
Oh, I think Chris is losing his voice, or else maybe he's actually taking.
I'm back. There we go.
He's taking a shot in the actual game. I couldn't tell. But yeah, so the archive of this will be up on History Respawn's YouTube channel. You just search YouTube History Respawn. It'll also be on our website, historyrespawn.com. And I think that does it for today's stream. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Chris. And hopefully
thanks very much, everybody.
We can have you back sometime in the future with more First World War games. Fingers crossed.
Yes. Fantastic.